Morning, everyone. Sorry for that slightly delayed start, but my laptop is now serviceable again. So we were looking at. I was trying to share some of Rav Kook's thoughts, and in particular, the focus I've sort of chosen for myself, um, looking at the ideas of in focusing on the ideas of Rav Kook, is looking at his spiritually suffused universe view, a world in which he lived, which is just radiating the divine and suffused with spirituality. And the reason I chose this thread is because it's so central to him as a mystic, as an oyev, a lover of oyev of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, someone who lives in this universe just radiating ruchnius, radiating spirituality. And many of his more famous and also his less famous views really emerge from this perspective. So his embrace of Zionism isn't just because he loves Eretz Israel, but because he's able to see something which other great people don't see or can't see. He's able to believe that a movement largely driven at some of its stages by youth who are sometimes throwing out all that is old and all that is traditional, and that there is a militant stream of this in some parts of Zionism, he can believe that out of that can emerge something positive. He can believe that even pre-Mashiach, a Jewish state can carry within it an expression, a genuine and authentic expression of how Torah sees a nation as existing. And this affects his views towards art, his views towards modern philosophy, his views towards science, his views of irreligious people. Perhaps he wouldn't even like that terminology, irreligious people. He doesn't really see there's such a thing. It affects his views of the masses and the intuition of the masses about things. So this is a thread that runs through so much of his thoughts, and therefore this is the thread that I've sort of decided to focus on. But I want to emphasize that he's a dazzlingly original and brilliant thinker. And I just want to share one example of that in continuing some of the ideas we were looking at last week. So last week I spoke about his openness to science. In a sense, he's perhaps one of the three founding fathers of what maybe we would call modern Orthodoxy nowadays, or Orthodoxy in the modern world, alongside Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Hirsch. And by that I mean he doesn't either reject science, like some people do, or accommodate it as a pragmatic necessity, but he sees it as offering genuine spiritual insight. And one example we looked at last week was that of evolution, in which he says, "Wow, this is amazing." He does write words of caution. He says, "Science, we shouldn't let science supersede Chas v'Shalom Torah. Scientific theories sometimes come and go." And what yesterday was convincing withers like a beautiful petal, and tomorrow like a blossom that withers, and tomorrow is no longer convincing. So he's not saying we have to rush full and headlong into every latest scientific fad. However, there are scientific truths that are revealed, and we should be open to them, and sometimes they carry them a great spiritual content. And I shared last week this what I think is a lovely turn of phrase, in which he sees evolution as how the actualized infinite being manages to bring into realization that which possesses infinite potential. And in that line lies so much. He sees, to him, the answer to the question of how God, the infinite, can relate to creation, the finite, or how there can be space for finite physical existence within within an infinite being. And his answer to the question is because the finite has infinite potential. And he sees in evolution an example of that, how out of what ostensibly appears to be a bunch of chemicals, eventually life can emerge. And eventually this life can multiply into this grandeur of creation that we see. And out of that life can emerge human beings who carry within them spiritual potential and are capable of touching infinity, achieving things of real meaning. So he looks at that and he says, what an incredible universe we live in which a swirling marsh of a chemical soup, out of that can emerge humans who are capable of creating works of art and science and ultimately spirituality. That's amazing. That's Adrab. I see in that an uncovering of an infinite potential to which we were oblivious for millennia. We never realized that when we look at a piece of mud, that mud carries in it the potential for to bring out of itself humanity and with all its infinite spirituality. So that's Rav Kook's point around evolution, and an example of not just his embrace of science, but also his and his openness to science, but his belief that science can give genuine insight and to see in it a sort of divinity. I don't think anyone else in history could have seen in evolution this glowing spirituality. He also has an amazingly bold and brave and original way of looking at things, because if there's a number of problems, for example, with evolution as a theory that aligns with Torah sources. Last week we were looking at it from a conceptual level. Never mind Pshuta Shel Mikra and the Psukim and age of the universe and everything else, but conceptually, surely this negates God's role as the designer of everything and the one that brings into life everything. And Rav Kook, as we said, turns it on its head, and he says, no, on the contrary, what an amazing universe in which God imbues the physical universe with the potential to bring out this infinite life. But what do we do with the Psukim? The Psukim seem to tell a very different story. So in this sense, Rav Kook is perhaps the originator of what's become a very common refrain amongst those that dabble in these things. And again, to some this is outrageous, to others this is obvious, but just to share Rav Kook's ideas around this. And Rav Kook says, look, the Rambam in his Mon Avuchim taught us that we can read Psukim and need to understand that these are sometimes using human terms to allow us to conceive, to grasp ideas which are ultimately beyond our comprehension. And the Rambam really takes this off a Mama Chazal said in a very limited halachic context, in which the Gemara says, Dibra Torah K'lashon B'nei Adam, the Torah sometimes speaks in human language. The Gemara says this, for example, in the context of a discussion about some of the double language that the Torah uses. Hashev Teshivim, you should surely return, the double language. Hacheach Techiach, you should surely rebuke, this double expression. And the Gemara is discussing whether this double phrase has a drasha in it. We know that the Gemara takes seriously every word and every phrase of the Torah, obviously. And when we see a double expression like that, is that trying to hint something to us? Rebuke, hashev tashev, return the lost object or the like. And one opinion of the Gemara is no. The answer is Dibra Torah K'lashon B'nei Adam. This is how language works, and this is how you speak. And then the Gemara uses this in a couple of other examples. This is how the Torah should be expressed. There's a similar concept in Chazal, which Rashi al HaTorah references on occasion, in which something is said to satisfy the ear in order to allow the ear to comprehend something. For example, we just had in last week's Sadra Yisro that we just read, the mountain is described as Har Sinai Kuloi Oshon Kishon. The mountain is smoking like an oven. Rashi said Kishon Shel Sid, like a lime maker's oven. I don't know exactly what that is, but it's an oven that smokes, a lime making oven. It smokes exceedingly, and the mountain is smoking like that. Now, I've never seen a lime kiln, but I imagine it has like a plume of smoke that comes up from it. It doesn't look like a mountain that's smoking. So this is the sabbath ozon. It's a metaphor. Don't read this pasuk and say, the mountain smoking like a lime kiln. Exactly how and what quantity and what size and everything else. The Torah is allowed to use metaphor to help us understand things. It's that's not a stira to the kedusha of Torah and the infinite eternal value of Torah. It's simply a vehicle through which the Torah expresses itself. You want to say that more philosophically, this isn't coming from a limit in Hashem, it's coming from a limit in us, our ability to comprehend. So the Rambam takes ideas like this, and we're not going to discuss them at too much length now. And he says something which has become an absolute given to all of us, has become completely obvious to all of us, that when the Pasuk talks about Yad Hashem, the hands of Hashem, Zroya Natuya, an outstretched arm, Yad Chazaka, strong hands of Hashem, Einei Hashem Elokecha, the eyes of God are over Mereshus Hashanah, Adachris Hashanah. It doesn't mean that Vayicha Af, the anger of Hashem burns, fumes. It doesn't mean that Hashem has anger. It doesn't mean that he has hands. It doesn't mean that he has eyes. It doesn't mean he has arms. It's simply using human language, to help us understand concepts which are beyond our understanding. For us, the way we action is through arms and hands. To us, the way we see is through eyes, etc. To us, the way we interact and channel energy is through emotions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has that and more. He sees, but without eyes. He more than has eyes. He more than has arms. He more than has legs. He is more than angry. Anger is simply, or arms and hands and eyes are simply pale vehicles of trying to describe to us that which is ungraspable because it's infinite, because it's beyond us. We use this in our human language the whole time also. Even when I'm talking about concepts, I say a graspable concept to help us grasp the idea. Grasp means a physical Caesar or something. We only have physical language to use as borrowed terminology to talk about concepts. We talk about a concrete example and the like. I want to use an idea. We only have the vehicle of physical movement and tools in order to explain concept. Similarly, the Torah is Dibra Torah Koloshim Adam, says the Rambam. Says Rav Kook, we can extend this, and here it's hard to know how far he would go with this. But he says we can certainly extend this to parts of the Torah in which the Torah is clearly describing that which is incomprehensible to us and helping us understand this. And he speaks about this in the context of Maisa Bereshis. And again, I'm simply quoting over here. I'm wary that we're talking quite swiftly about ideas that that border on the fundamental, on Ikrei Umunah. I think I've done a series before. I can't remember in this setting or perhaps in an earlier iteration on Wednesday night. We looked at great length at evolution and age of the universe and various other things. So I don't want to rush through what really deserves a sort of serious study in its own right. But here we're just quoting Rav Kook, and he says that it's perfectly feasible that many of the descriptions of the Torah are metaphor for us to describe more fundamental ideas and things that kind of taken longer or express themselves in different ways. He says such a beautiful idea, and I just want to share with you one nugget of how he puts this. He speaks about the creation of humanity and the creation of male and female, and a vision in the Torah in which originally male and female were created as one, and then Adam, human, falls into a tardema, and in this sleep, the human is operated on and split into two, into male and female. And Adam emerges and says, "This is etzemei atzmosai. This is a bone of my bones, basar b'basari, flesh of my flesh, etc." And he says in such beautiful language, he says this tardema, this deep sleep, can have been one that took thousands of years. This can be a sleep of human consciousness and human reason, until man and woman were originally created to be one, to have a commitment of relationship, monogamy, to work together as soulmates, as partners in life. This is how Kadosh Baruch Hu created us. But then man fell into a deep sleep. Humans took a long time to wake up from this sleep and learn slowly to recognize that, and eventually emerge and say, monogamy, a proper relationship. We are of the same bones, the same flesh, and form a genuine union. So he sees in that little episode of Adam falling asleep as a sort of metaphor for a darkness and sleep that descended over humanity, in which humans were created, again with his language, with infinite potential, but it takes us a long time to get there. Such a wonderful and amazing reading of the Psukim, and you just look at that and wow, like what better way would we can describe this, right? You even see writers describing this as, I don't know, after the fall of Rome, a great darkness, a great sleep descends over Europe as it goes through the Dark Ages, and then it emerges and so on. So you see that sort of language used in poetic language. This is how he reads the psukim of the Tardem, the deep sleep that falls over Adam as he's as he goes through this experience. So I hope this gives a sense of some of the sort of beautiful thought of Rav Kook around these ideas. Another idea that we touched upon in our we did touch upon in our Sunday series, and again the core, the nuggets of the idea comes from the Rambam in his Moed Nevuchim, but Rav Kook extends this in staggering ways. Is the idea of developing morality. does the Torah represent the highest moral status that humans can achieve, or merely a basic level of morality? Is it appropriate for us to have moral sensitivities beyond those that the Torah expresses? For example, if we find the Torah allowing slavery, does that mean we're committed to the idea that slavery is an ideal, it's perfectly fine, evidently? Or is it possible that humans can develop a sensitivity in which we repudiate this, we think this is terrible? Or is there something disgusting about that? Are we trying to be frummer than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, frummer than Hashem in saying that? Vegetarianism, right? So probably most Jewish thinkers think if the Torah says that meat is allowed and is meant to be consumed, and Adarabah, we see that in Kabbalah, we see that in Simchas Yom Tov, then clearly choosing vegetarianism as a moral choice is wrong, is inappropriate. The Torah says this is allowed. And again, if one objects to modern day farming and so on, then that's a different thing. But in principle, the concept of eating meat, if you say that's immoral, well, surely again you're trying to be frummer than Hashem. Hashem said this is moral. Are these ideas appropriate or not? And Rav Kook thinks that yes, he thinks that the Torah sets us a basic moral standard, but built into the Torah is an idea of the development of human morality. It tries to trigger a journey and a project in which we can embark, in which we can have and develop enhanced morality to certain things also. And if one wants to give this a language that makes it more comfortable, we're familiar with the idea that when it comes to halacha, you can have basic halacha and then a chumrah, a stringency. We're familiar with the idea that you can have a basic performance of the mitzvah and then a hidur, a beautification of the mitzvah. So he's simply saying in moral life also, why can't you have a basic halacha that allows something and a hidur, a beautification, or a chumrah, a stringency in which this isn't allowed? And the Rambam we saw in his Mode of Uchim expresses slightly similar ideas. He quotes the psukim that we just read a few weeks ago in a wonderful way. The Rambam in Mode of Uchim, he quotes the pasuk that Hashem had to take us on a slower journey from Egypt to the lands of Canaan, because it takes time for us human beings, for slaves, newly escaped slaves, to develop the resilience to be able to fight the Pelishtim and to go into Eretz Israel. We had to go on a slower journey. Says the Rambam, this isn't a limit in Hashem's ability. Hashem can take us as fast as he wants from Egypt to the lands of Israel. It's a limit in our ability to travel fast. Humans can only travel at a certain pace in life, in this context of psukim, in their ability to develop the self-confidence of freedom. And similarly in moral development, humans, says the Rambam, humans can't instantly go from 0 to 60 in 0 seconds. It takes time to develop moral sensitivity. And therefore, the Torah leads us on a project which initiates and triggers moral growth and moral development over time, such that there are moral insights we can achieve that would have been unachievable or unavailable in the past. And that's okay. That's how the system works. For example, in the context of avdus, in the context of slavery, the Torah sets in place a very, very strict set of parameters about how we can treat a slave. We're not talking about the treatment of the tragic treatment of slaves in the American South and the like. There's built into the halachic system a basic recognition of the humanity of the slave. Nonetheless, it allows it in such a world, in such a society, this was a necessity. But the dream is that over time, this triggers our awareness of, 1 minute, if this person in front of me is Selom Elokim, is also made in the image of Hashem, if they also have to be treated as a human, then surely the whole system needs to be relooked at. Is there morality behind the whole system? And Rav Kook references classic ideas in Chazal to demonstrate this. For example, the Yefas Toya, the story of the Yefas Toya, which the Gemara in Kedushin says is not an ideal, but is a reluctant accommodation to human weakness. The Yefas Toya is the beautiful captive who, again, I don't want to go through the whole halachas in detail, but basically an idea that a woman who is captured in war, a soldier is allowed to take home. She has to be given a period of mourning for her family. She can only be taken into marriage if she's granted the full rights of marriage. She has to be niskaya, she has to be converted, and then granted the full status of wife. There isn't such a thing as allowing her to be a concubine or a pelegesh or anything like this. So on the one hand, the Torah is giving her a basic treatment. If the person who captured her chooses not to take her as a wife, she has to be set free. So there is a morality, a base level morality built into this, in which the soldier is being reminded, one minute this is a human being who has a family for whom she needs to mourn, who, if you do wish to take her as a partner, she has to get the full rights of a wife. There's something very, very powerful in all of this, but also behind it is something problematic. At the end of the day, she's being taken captive and forced into a relationship not of her choosing. Says the Gemara about this, Lo dibra Torah ela k'neged yetzirah. The Torah is speaking as a reluctant accommodation to human weakness. In battle to this day, the testosterone is raging, it's difficult for people to control themselves. Rather than a blanket ban, the Torah says, look, let's channel this and provide a route and an opportunity, which is unlikely actually to come into fruition, because as the soldier calms down and returns back home and so on, the chance of this being actualized, and if it is, at least she's given citizenship rights. She becomes a Gioris and given full rights. What do you see in this Gemara? That the Torah is accommodating a basic level of morality, saying that this is good enough, this is a pass. But of course there's room to be mahader more. Do we think that a tzaddik, an Adam Gadol, would rely on this hatter? The Gemara is telling us explicitly not. This isn't the best moral standards to behave, and therefore Rav Kook is open to moral insight in modernity. Now, again, I want to emphasize 2 points. This comes from his view of a world suffused in the divine, suffused in divinity. And therefore, as he sees modern day sensibilities and ethical sensitivities emerging, which weren't really spoken about in the past, he's open to that. He says there's things of which we are aware that previous generations weren't wholly aware of, or maybe only the greatest of the generations were aware, but not the average person. And it wasn't a norm for Klal Yisrael. And yet this can become a norm to which we are and should be appropriately sensitive. There's a unfolding of the divine plan. Again, a bit like evolution, right? Things are moving and developing and unfolding. There's a spirituality that's suffusing the world, and this spirituality, this echo of this spiritual voice, can be heard sometimes even via people who aren't from within. This isn't I'll come to it in a moment. This isn't a project initiated by the Chofetz Chaim. This can be emerging from other sources, and yet we need to keep our ears open and hear that sensitivity if we are to grow and to be open to how the Torah wants us to move forward. So he sees that spiritual sensitivity in the world. I just want to say one more point, and then I'll take the questions, which is clearly this is also a fundamentally dangerous idea, a radically dangerous idea. This opens a terrible can of worms, because if this is so, then what modern ideas are we open to? What aren't we open to? What new ethical sensibilities are appropriate? Which ones aren't? Very, very difficult. We have discussed this at greater length, so I don't want to belabor the point, other than to say, obviously, one needs to proceed with extreme caution. One needs to check this is not a passing fad. One needs to check these values align with the values of the Torah. So if we look at Yafas Toya, we look at slavery, clearly a very central value of the Torah is human dignity. So it has to align with the values of the Torah, and we have to take it into the base medrash. We have to analyze it. We have to think about it with care. It can only lead bad news to a chumrah, not a kula. Right? It's telling us you can't own slaves. It can't be mati, allow that which is forbidden. It can say avoid that which we would have thought is allowed. So there's parameters to this. Nonetheless, this is a radical and shocking thought. And in a moment, I'll give a case study of an example that Rav Kook is very famous for having given. But I just see two questions. Yeah.
Probably preempting you actually.
Yeah.
Is one example of this approach regarding korbanos, where the animals
yes.
could be
yes. Yes, and we'll speak about that. Yes, korbanos is exactly an example of that. Yes.
That's a perfect question. You read this his own vision.
Okay, he touches it a little bit. The question for those online is about Yuridas Hadoros. The truth is, Yuridas Hadoros is in some respects a little bit of a myth, or it's over presented and missold. So Yuridas Hadoros is the concept of the decline of the generations. Again, it really deserves its whole mini series to look at properly. The concept comes from Chazal, who say if previous generations were like malachim to you, then you can be like humans. If previous generations were like humans to you, then you are a mere chamar, a mere donkey. A concept that we shouldn't compare ourselves to previous generations. If their hearts were open, kapiska shel ulam, then ours are open, kapiska shel macha. All sorts of phrases like that. So this comes in from the Gemara. It comes in halachic sources in which, by and large, we give precedence to earlier generations over later generations, and Amora wouldn't argue with the Tana, Rishon wouldn't argue with a Gemara, Achronim don't argue with Rishonim, and so on. So this reflects in the halachic sources also. Having said that, it's much more complicated, and that's what I mean when I say it's a myth in the sense of how widely it's used. Even in halacha, within an era, for example, there's a concept of halacha kabasroi, that the halacha follows the later one, not the earlier one. And the basis of this is that the later one has had time to consider the arguments of the earlier person, but the earlier person hasn't had time to consider the arguments of the later person. So even in halacha, there's dry halacha, there's a recognition that ideas evolve and develop, and sometimes things take hundreds of years to be thrashed out. And sometimes there's insight, therefore, that a later figure can achieve than earlier one didn't have. Perhaps a bit like the idea of dwarves on the shoulders of giants, which I think it was Newton's phrase, in which when he was asked about how he could argue with the early Greek philosophers, he said this. So he said, "Yes, I'm a dwarf," echoing the Gemara. I'm a human compared to an angel. I recognize their genius, but at the end of the day, I have the privilege of being able to engage them in conversation. They didn't have the opportunity of engaging me in conversation. So I'll just finish this point. Sorry. So even in halacha, there's nuance around this, and then there's a lot of discussion about why halacha works like this. Is this because of a fundamental assumption of greater insight, or as per the Rambam, is this because there were unique halachic circumstances in the past which don't exist today? The idea that, for example, all the Jews were basically living in one kehillah, there was a constant conversation taking place between all the Talmidei Chachamim of the Dor. If you think back to Bovel and Eretz Yisrael in the past, whereas nowadays we're scattered, there's a range of minhagim, a range of halachic styles, a range of approaches. In others, are there more mechanical reasons for this? Or is this simply about an ability to connect to Har Sinai, given that halacha is built from the Sinai revelation, and therefore halacha is handed down through the generations? By definition, there's a handing down process that takes place. So what is obvious in a halachic framework may not be obvious in a non-halachic framework. And here I just want to say one short point, that both in the thoughts of the Kabbalists and the thoughts of the philosophers, there is agreement that there are spiritual insights we can achieve that previous generations did not have. Very, very interesting. Explicit in the, and please God, the Arizal maybe will be one of the great thinkers that we have a chance to look at. And I think I've touched on this before, explicit in the Arizal or claims of ongoing revelation in terms of Kabbalistic insight, Gilei Eliyahu, Magid, angelic revelation, and so on. In halacha, as the Rambam builds into his halachic system, we can't innovate new halachas. We can merely reason from existing halachic paradigms and halachic principles. But in the spiritual world, Kabbala is full of the idea that there's greater Kabbalistic insight than perhaps existed in the past. So the Arizal in the 1500s can have spiritual insight that the Gaonim in the year 900 or 800 didn't have. The Baal Shem Tov, with the claim of again, please God, the Baal Shem Tov is someone that we'll have a chance to look at, with the claim of Hasidic revelation and so on. So the Kabbalists are full of this, and the Rambam in his philosophical work makes the same claim from a philosophical perspective, that there's philosophical issues that have been trashed out that weren't clear in the past, as per some of the ideas I just shared. So this idea that there's insights we can have that didn't exist in the past is even though it's sort of a norm in halachic discourse, that the concept of Yuridas Adoros is not one that is taken for granted in other areas. Again, very, very difficult ideas that need their own exploration. But here I'm simply just trying to summarize some of Rav Kook's thoughts. Sorry, yes.
What was the consensus of the opinion when he came out with these ideas at the time? First part of the question. The second part of the question is, looking back on it now, what is the consensus of the Gedolei Hador, shall we say, of Rav Kook? Has this changed, and has the?
So that's a very, very interesting question. When I spoke about his life, I tried to share how institutionally none of the major institutions adopted him as their Das Torah, we could call it, or something like that. How most of his peers, his friends from Volozhin and that world, and Old Yishuv, who went on to become Gedolim themselves, were profoundly bothered by much of what he said. Some of the things he said raised an absolute storm. I mentioned his speech at the opening of the Hebrew University in Kimitzi and Sefer Torah, which upsets everyone. The secular supporters are upset that he seems to be saying that secular wisdom is merely a vehicle for spiritual insight. The Frum supporters are upset by him granting the place he does to secular wisdom. So there's a lot of upset around. I'll come to the moment. There's a lot of upset around his ideas. Most of the Gedolim of his Dor do not. They're upset with him. they'll argue with him, but they do not dismiss him. They don't. He's put in cherem by various lesser bodies, but his peers avoid such an outright extreme reaction, even though they're very, very troubled by a lot of what he says. So that's in his lifetime. He has Talmidim who also are somewhat influenced by him, who eventually repudiate him. It's unclear exactly to what degree. I can only share with you the facts. So, for example, Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner, a very, very great man, one of the Gedolim of the next generation, has Rav Kook's Haskoma to his Sefer, Torah Sanozeh, in the first print, and later it's removed. He doesn't print the Haskoma in later prints. It's unclear, again, whether this is because he recognizes that in the Olam Yeshivas this isn't going to be a recognized Haskama. There's various quotes about things that Rav Yitzchak Kutner said about Rav Kook. It's unclear to what degree, but there certainly is a ripple of discomfort around these ideas. Look, we look back on this, and there's no doubt that Rav Kook has become one of the most influential Gedolim of that generation, and there are massive communities of Yereim and Shleimim with exceptional Yiras Shamayim, Avas Hashem, and knowledge of Torah, for whom he is the primary or a primary hashkafic and halachic influence. And out of his base of medrash has emerged, Baruch Hashem, the flourishing Torah worlds of the Dati Numi world in Israel. His influence in Chutz La'aretz is very, very limited. Unfortunately, in Chutz La'aretz, all that most people know about him is that he was a supporter of religious Zionism. That's one of the reasons why I chose him as my first great thinker. Sorry? And vegetarianism, maybe, like two things known about him. And that's very sad. That's a pity. But he's influenced, he's had a massive impact on Klal Yisrael. And finally, as I said, it's difficult to conceive. I have to tell you, I mean, it's very difficult playing catch up with history and the gift of hindsight and the like. To me, it seems clear that had there not been powerful Torah leadership that were willing to embrace Zionism, the idea of millions of Jews living in Eretz Israel now with no positive embrace of the Rabbanut, with no Rabbanut Tzvayit, with no structure of from life on an institutional state level, the mind boggles at where Klal Yisrael could have been, Rahman Litzlan, and what a mess we could be in. And this isn't really my point. This point was made by another thinker we could do, the Sridei Eish, Rav Weinberg, who wrote a letter, again, another very interesting figure, a product of Slobodka, friendly with all the Gedolim of the next generation. He's a Dora later than Rav Kook. He survives the war and flourished and lives in post-war Europe. Very, very interesting figure. And he's a friend and a colleague of Briskerov and the Chazon Ish and the whole world of Haredi leadership. He goes and buries himself in Switzerland, away out of the center of world Jewry. He can't really handle the whole post-war, the whole everything that's going on. But he writes a very pained letter to the manhigim of the Haredi world in Eretz Israel. And he says, I think you're shirking your duty. Because, again, I want you to understand this because it's really, really important. The Haredi leadership made an exceptionally powerful and valuable and important decision. And they said, we are going to focus inwards on rebuilding a Torah world with no compromise, with a partition between us and anyone who doesn't buy into pure Torah values. And this is vital and necessary to rebuild a Torah fortress. And this is the only way post-war, in a post-war Israel, where there's a handful of Torah scholars, this is what we're going to do. And they turn inwards and they build what again is an enormous and flourishing Torah world. We don't need to talk about it. Rav Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, turns to them and says, you've let sink everyone else. And if it wasn't for the dirty work being done by those who are willing to engage with the outside world, who are losing, yes, a certain purity and a certain protection. Who on earth you're leaving stranded the whole of the rest of Jewry? And I'm not just here talking about the secular Jewry. I'm talking about even from Jews who are less learned, less engaged, less willing to maybe even wrongly so, right? Jews are willing to compromise, but still align themselves with being religious. And even I don't want to rush through what's a complicated part of history. Again, the Chazon Ish really deserves to be spoken about also as a Jewish thinker, and please God, we will come to him. But he says you've left stranded a whole world, and what would have happened had there not been the Da'at Leumi world to engage with this? In my view, and this is just, I try and avoid my own views around this, but it seems to me that in hindsight, both worlds were necessary. And there needed to be a fortress that closed itself off and rebuilt. I shared with you that there were certain times in the Da'at Leumi history, perhaps in the late 80s, early 90s, in which there was a dearth of, it was getting scarily close to a loss of continued Torah scholarship in that world. And I remember when I came to Israel in the early 1990s, a very influential, I came to Israel, I can't remember if I'm repeating myself, I came from growing up in Northwest London where we never heard, I have never heard the words Haredi or modern Orthodox really. None of these terms existed when I was growing up. And I arrived in Israel fascinated to discover this whole world about which I knew nothing. I met my first YU Nicks. I didn't know anyone from YU. I hadn't really heard much about Rav Soloveitchik and had the zchus of sort of going to hear Rav Shechter and really speaking great people and open begin reading Rav Soloveitchik's words and so on. My yeshiva was in Givat Shal, very near Merkas Harav, and I was fascinated by this whole world that I knew nothing about and went there. And I remember reading a piece by Rav Neria, one of the Rosh Hashivas and leaders of the Bnei Akiva movement, and he wrote there. This was in the early 90s. He said we're running out of Torah in our world. Like we haven't made a critical mass of learning Torah. We now look in 2024 and we see the vibrant yeshivas, the yeshivas of the Kav, Har Hamor and Merkaz Harav and so on, and then we see the non-Kav yeshivas. We see Baruch Hashem an amazing flourishing of an Olam HaTorah. But in some ways, you needed a sort of ring-fenced, put in a box world which preserved a purity of Torah Masorah, but paid a price in there. And you needed a world that was going to engage with Israeli society and actually lift it. So in hindsight, without that hanhaga of Rav Kook, it's scary to think about where the Jewish world would be today. That's point number one. Point number two is 100 years ago, there was a viable philosophy out there which went like this, that Zionism, even religious Zionism, is irrevocably, inevitably going to draw people away from Judaism. It's going to be a terrible secularization process. If you're in a displaced person camp, a DP camp in Europe in 1946, for the sake of your future, for the sake of your children's souls, go to America, not to Israel, because Israel is being led by this fanatically secularist movement out to destroy the from world and Judaism, and there were some traces of truth in this. There was a very, very strong far left militant straight, and you could hear that machlokas, and there was a real machlokas. As late as the 1980s, Rav Shach was still saying, if Israeli government does this, we'll pack our bags and go to America, which is the land of the free, where religion can flourish, and America's not interfering with our from life. We can do what we want. We look back from hindsight with 2024, and it wasn't, and I want to emphasize it was not obvious at the time. And we see an amazing country which is so infused with ruchnius and with godliness, and we see how the statistics are there. I mean, Israel is 90% emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. An amazing thing. Not everyone is home, not everyone's keeping halacha, but such a positive energy towards it. A re-engagement, yeshivat chiloniyot, the Kabbala Shabbos on the beaches of Tel Aviv. 20 years ago, Tel Aviv, it was hard to find a vibrant shul or learning or Torah or even restaurants that were kosher. And you now go and Tel Aviv is an Ir Torah again. So we look with hindsight and we can say, like Baruch Hashem, what an amazing flourishing of Torah this is led to. And it's hard to see any of that having happened without Rav Kook's voice. So it's very important, I think, to understand this and see that to some degree or other. To me, it seems that if someone, I don't see how anyone can turn to a Talmud of Rav Kook, for whom Rav Kook is their base of Medrash, and say Rov Gedolim held not like him. It is a fact. Rov Gedolim held not like him. In arguable fact that he is in the minority view. But he was the Rebbe of a whole generation, and the Rebbe's Rebbe of whole generations of Rosh Yeshivas and Paiskim who have a flourishing Torah world, and they're entitled to follow their minority view. So that's a very long answer to your question.
In his own time, was he defending his position, or
he took a number of techniques. Some of the time he argued his position, some of the time he was conciliatory about it, and some of the time he self-censored. So some of his stuff, he self-censored on a number of levels. Some of his ideas he only shared with his very close circle of Talmidim, and others of ideas he didn't even share with them and are found in his Pinkus, in his in his booklets, in his writings. I mentioned already he just wrote prolifically, wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and writings of him are still being published today. Endless volumes of writing. It's phenomenal, his output. It's always a little bit, one has to be a little bit cautious about the writing of a thinker in which they write in their own notebooks, because this can represent Havemina's thoughts, ideas that they're reflecting upon, so one has to know this. You should know that to this day censorship continues of his writings. So even his Talmid and Talmidim are embarrassed about some stuff he said and cover it up because they're nervous about publicizing it. So to this day, for better or for worse, it's a separate topic, the concepts of self-censorship and censorship. To this day, some of the ideas are only available in smuggled copies of sort of very, very controlled copies of his writings. Yeah. Yes, he did recognize that he was being controversial. He knew that he was not saying standard stuff 100%. 100. Yeah, he knew he was an original and creative thinker. Yeah.
What the reason for my colleagues at the time in the there is the ideas could work, but it's the dangerous ideas very much.
I don't know. Again, for those online, a very big question. Did they not go against him because they were friends? Option number one. Option number two, because they recognized there was legitimacy in his ideas. Or option number three, because they recognized him as a godel, albeit a quirky one. So at the end of the day, when you have a great person saying outlandish views, you may try and minimize his influence, and they did that successfully. You make sure he doesn't have too many Talmidim. But he's an Odom, he's a great person, a world-class Chacham. I don't think anyone has ever denied that even his fiercest critics have denied that he's a world-class Chacham. He was a giant in halacha, in hashkafa, in tzidkus, in personal piety, and at every level he was. I don't think anyone ever dreamt of not recognizing that. So again, there's three reasons why. It could be they recognize there's some truth, but we're scared about how he was saying it, or they just didn't know what to make of him, but recognize that he's, albeit eccentric, a god will be strong, and therefore didn't want to attack. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I will come to that. So I will make sure I don't finish today's session without speaking about that. Yes.
Elaborate further on this question whether the unholy can be a animal, or an agent.
Yes. So I will deal with this next week. Yes. I touched on it last week and I'll deal with it next week. The concept of holiness coming from the unholy ties into this mystical worldview, which I described, in which there's a union, an ultimate union of everything. And ultimately, even that which is impure has to have a purity within it. Otherwise, it can't exist, that sort of mystical idea. And I'll revisit it next week when we talk about natural morality. For this week, I'll just conclude with vegetarianism, since this is a case study of development of morality. And Rav Kook is open, unlike most other Jewish thinkers, to the concept of vegetarianism being a legitimate value. He doesn't see this as a defiance of Hashem. Again, obviously, we don't have an issue with someone who's vegetarian because of ecological damage or the current cruel treatment of animals or health or personal discomfort. But someone who says, I think it is immoral to eat meat in and of itself, there should be a response to that person, which is, well, clearly the Torah disagrees with you, God disagrees with you, because he does allow it. So is that a legitimate claim to make or not? And Rav Kook says, yes, I think it is. In the same way as we can say there's developing morality around slavery, similarly, there can be developing morality around vegetarianism. And again, I've spoken about this at greater length in the past, so I'll just summarize his views on the matter. And he says the Torah allows meat as an accommodation to where humans are up to, human weakness. Most humans need meat in order to be healthy. They don't have access to a varied enough diet. Most humans like meat. It's not a first priority in spiritual development. There's other things. The Torah sets a base level. There's other things to work on. But in the same way as over time we recognize the value of women, maybe that's the first stage, or then we grow to recognize the value of all humans, and slavery becomes repudiated. Eventually, we need to recognize that mistreatment of animals and cruelty towards animals is also wrong. The Torah modifies it. It gives us laws of shechita to make us more reflective. It gives us laws of kashrus. But nonetheless, however humane shechita is, the animal doesn't love it. It's not a great experience. It's not a great day out to go to a trip to the abattoir. So there's no way of pretending that this is an ideal. There's no way of pretending that this is perfectly moral. Says Rav Kook, one should be uncomfortable about it. If one does eat meat because one needs to for one's own enjoyment or for health, that's legitimate. It's legitimate for someone to say the Torah accommodates it, it allows it. It's legitimate for someone to say there's other sensitivities I need to work on first. I need to have a certain enjoyment in my life, and this is ultimately mutter. But a sensitive person should aspire at least to head towards that. And he says, I'll just quote a number of things that he says. The first thing he says, having arrived as a European Rav to Jaffa, and for the first time meeting Sephardi communities in action, he says, I think the Sephardim have got something right that we Ashkenazim haven't got right. In the Ashkenazi world, in the shtetl, there were a number of Klei Kodesh, a number of dignitaries in the city, a number of spiritual leaders. There was the Rav, who was one of the spiritual leaders. There was the Chazan, maybe, if it was a shul, a community that had a Chazan. The Moel, there were a few people, the Malamed, and there was the Shochet. The Shochet was considered one of the senior religious spiritual people in the town, and very often second to the Rav. It was like the second most choshev sort of spiritual position. He then came to Eretz Israel, where he saw in Sephardi communities, the Shochet was treated like an abattoir worker. He was considered a basic worker. He was working with blood and gore and animals. The Shochtim knew enough halacha to know how to shecht, but there was a posek who knew the sophisticated understanding of halachas, and Shochtim didn't get much respect. And says Rav Kook, I think that's the more appropriate model, because shechita is a reluctant accommodation to human weakness, but this is not an ideal. At the end of the day, you're taking cruelty towards an animal. Let's not pretend otherwise. So this is a view that he put forward. Yes. So the pashtus of the whole halachic system is that korbanos will be restored. All korbanos will be restored, including the carbon pesach. Says Rav Kook, that may be initially the case, but in the long run, eventually we will even move away from korbanos. In a world in which people are eating meat, and meat is in a way the most significant way in which humans assert their mastery over the rest of creation, taking another life. So that's an appropriate way to serve Hashem. But in the long run, this will be unrolled, and we will move to vegetarian korbanos. And he brings a tefillah that we say, V'arvol Hashem we daven, minchas Yehuda, that the mincha offering of Yehuda will be pleasant Hashem Kameolam like it was in the past. Why the mincha offering? Because that's the vegetarian carbon. That is flour and oil and wine and so on. That is the I'll share off camera in a few moments a funny story about that. But not one that I'm willing to have recorded.
Down to when the Kodesh Baruch Hu, when he was giving the Torah with Cain and Hevel.
So he speaks about that also, that this is an initial thing. Are we ready for this? It's a process. In a world in which we're eating meat, to avoid giving our Kodesh Baruch Hu meat is avoiding giving that which is most fundamental to us. But in the long run, that will be unraveled. Now, I just want to point out that this has a number of consequences to it and a number of similarities. First of all, the Rambam sees korbanos as an accommodation of human weakness also. Not because he's sensitive to the animal vegetarian issue, but because the whole concept of korbanos. And the Rambam says this is against pagan practice and so on. But then we have a problem because one of the ikrim is that no halacha will change. And the Rambam himself sort of addresses that despite everything I'm saying, no halacha will ever change. Even when Moshiach comes, halachas don't change, and therefore korbanos will carry on. Rav Kook here is arguing that over time, this is a halacha that will develop. So very, very controversial. We're touching on Ikrei Emunah here. And by the way, just as a personal note to everyone here, my personal take on all these things, especially when we're talking about Ikrei Emunah, is it makes sense for us to suspend judgment. It's legitimate for us to learn the words of the Gedolim on the subject, and I'm sharing you the words of the Gedolim. And that's it. I don't have an ability here to and I don't think any of us should sort of begin taking sides in these arguments. I think we should, on a personal level, we have to make a decision to be vegetarian or not, or whatever it is. But I don't think we should tie ourselves down to definitive stances over matters which are profoundly unclear. But this is Rav Kook's view. He thinks that eventually we'll shift towards this. He also highlights, he says, and in some ways this is prophetic in some ways. He says that there are also positive reasons why adopting vegetarianism before humans are ready for it can be dangerous. And he says you can begin blurring the distinction between animal and the human. And if vegetarianism takes off in a big way and animal rights increases significantly, he says, I worry that this will begin blurring the difference between animal and human, and it could. So he thinks there's a positive in this also, but it's all driven by a perspective in which he says this is a slow development in which things need unraveling. he experimented with vegetarianism for a time, and he ceased to be one for health reasons. He was unable to maintain a healthy diet. Famously, one of his most significant Talmidim, the Nozir, who I think I mentioned in previous weeks, was a vegetarian for life. So Rav Kook, again, he accepted the Torah says it's mutar. I'm not eating treifus, it's mutar. And therefore, if I felt this, he felt this was affecting his health, he didn't have access to living again in pre-48 Palestine and for time under Ottoman rule, under British rule. He just couldn't maintain a healthy diet without that, and therefore he held it was mutar. Ultimately, this is mutar. But again, this is a very significant example of his sensitivity, of evolving ethics in Rav Kook's thoughts. Of kabbalas, but which kabbalas? Not animal kabbalas in the long run, but we're temporarily asking. In Musaf, temporarily we're saying, By the way, the editions in which we spell out the kabbalas are later edition. They do not come from the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. In the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, we daven for the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash and kabbalas, that we should bring the kabbalas of each chag. When we read the psukim in which we say it will be this number of lambs and this number of things, that's an addition to the probably from the era of the Goyim, Yeah.
And that's actually not in the Sfardi Nusach. That's Edom Mizrach don't have that.
Yes, thank you. I can't see who you are because your iPhone, but whoever that is, thank you for your. Sorry. Okay. You can text me if you don't mind on the chat if you wish to tell me who contributed that. Thank you very much. Not in the Sfardi Nusach. So it's a later edition. Okay, we're running out of time, so we'll finish here. I'll just I'll go off recording and I'll just share a story which I have mixed feelings about. So anyway, to those who are online, I'll wish you a good day, and those who are here, I'll just share a less pleasant piece of personal Jewish history.